Tivazina, mother of 2 engineers, who was traveling third class on a pass with her 2 daughters-in-law. Like nuns with their mother superior, the 2 quiet women, their shawls pulled low over their foreheads, followed her in silence. The crowd made way for them. Tivazina's husband had been burned alive in a railway accident. She stood a little away from the body, where she could see it through the crowd, and sighed as if comparing the 2 cases. Each according to his fate, she seemed to say. Some die by the Lord's will, and look what's happened to him to die of rich living and mental illness. All the passengers came out and had a look at the corpse and went back to their compartments only for fear that something might be stolen. When they jumped out onto the track and picked flowers or took a short walk to stretch their legs, they felt as if the whole place owed its existence to the accident. And that without it neither the swampy meadow with hillocks, the broad river, nor the fine house and church on the steep opposite side would have been there. Even the diffident evening sun seemed to be a purely local feature. Its light probed the scene of the accident timidly, like a cow from a nearby herd come for a moment to take a look at the crowd. Misha had been deeply shaken by the event and had at first wept with grief and fright. In the course of the long journey, the suicide had come several times to their compartment and had talked with Misha's father for hours on end. He had said that he found relief in the moral decency, peace, and understanding which he discovered in him, and had asked him endless questions about fine points in law concerning bills of exchange, deeds of settlement, bankruptcy, and fraud. "Is that so?" he exclaimed at Gordon's answers. "Can the law be as lenient as that? My lawyer takes a much gloomier view." Each time that this nervous man calmed down, his traveling companion came from their first-class coach to drag him off to the restaurant to drink champagne. He was the thick-set, arrogant, clean-shaven, well-dressed lawyer who now stood over his body, showing not the least surprise. It was hard to escape the feeling that his client's ceaseless agitation had somehow been to his advantage. Misha's father described him as a well-known millionaire, Zhivago, a good-natured profligate, not quite responsible for his actions. When he had come to their compartment, he would, unrestrained by Misha's presence, talk about his son, a boy of Misha's age, and about his late wife. Then he would go on about his second family, whom he had deserted as he had the first. At this point he would remember something else, grow pale with terror, and begin to lose the thread of his story. To Misha he had shown an unaccountable affection, which probably reflected a feeling for someone else. He had showered him with presents, jumping out to buy them at the big stations, where the bookstalls in the first-class waiting rooms also sold toys and local souvenirs. He had drunk incessantly and complained that he had not slept for 3 months, and that as soon as he sobered up for however short a time he suffered torments unimaginable to any normal human being. At the end, he rushed into their compartment, grasped Gordon by the hand, tried to tell him something but found he could not, and dashing out onto the platform threw himself from the train. Now Misha sat examining the small wooden box of minerals from the Urals that had been his last gift. Suddenly there was a general stir. A handcar rolled up on the parallel track. A doctor, 2 policemen, and a magistrate with a cockade in his hat jumped out. Questions were asked in cold businesslike voices, and notes taken. The policemen and the guards, slipping and sliding awkwardly in the gravel, dragged the corpse up the embankment. A peasant woman began to wail. The passengers were asked to go back to their seats, the guard blew his whistle, and the train started on. 8 years old holy oil, Nika thought savagely, looking around the room for a way of escape. The voices of the guests were outside the door, and retreat was cut off. The room had 2 beds, his own and Voskobynikov's. With scarcely a moment's thought he crept under the first. He could hear them calling and looking for him in other rooms, surprised at his absence. Finally they entered the bedroom. "Well, it can't be helped," said Nikolai Nikolaevich. "Run along, Yura. Perhaps your friend will turn up later and you can play with him then." They sat talking about the student riots in Petersburg and Moscow, keeping Nika in his absurd and undignified confinement for about 20 minutes. At last they went out onto the veranda. Nika quietly opened the window, jumped out, and went off into the park. He had had no sleep the night before and was out of sorts. He was in his 14th year and was sick and tired of being a child. He had stayed awake all night and had gone out at dawn. The rising sun had cast the long dewy shadows of trees in loops over the park grounds. The shadow was not black but dark gray like wet felt. The heady fragrance of the morning seemed to come from this damp shadow on the ground, with strips of light in it like a girl's fingers. Suddenly a streak of quicksilver, as shiny as the dew on the grass, flowed by him a few paces away. It flowed on and the ground did not absorb it. Then, with an unexpectedly sharp movement, it swerved aside and vanished. It was a grass snake. Nika shuddered. He was a strange boy. When he was excited he talked aloud to himself, imitating his mother's predilection for lofty subjects and paradox. "How wonderful to be alive," he thought. "But why does it always hurt? God exists, of course. But if he exists, then it's me." He looked up at an aspen shaking from top to bottom, its wet leaves like bits of tinfoil. "I'll order it to stop." With an insane intensity of effort, he willed silently with his whole being, with every ounce of his flesh and blood. "Be still," and the tree at once obediently froze into immobility. Nika laughed with joy and ran off to the river to bathe. His father, the terrorist Dementy Dudarov, condemned to death by hanging but reprieved by the Tsar, was now doing forced labor. His mother was a Georgian princess of the Aristov family. A spoiled and beautiful woman, still young and always infatuated with one thing or another: rebellions, rebels, extremist theories, famous actors, unhappy failures. She adored Nika, turning his name, NGHEKINH, into 1,000 impossibly tender and silly nicknames such as Inochek or Nochenka, and took him to Tiflis to show him off to her family. There, what struck him most was a straggly tree in the courtyard of their house. It was a clumsy, tropical giant, with leaves like elephant's ears which sheltered the yard from the scorching southern sky. Nika could not get used to the idea that it was a plant and not an animal. It was dangerous for the boy to bear his father's terrible name. Ivan Ivanovich wished him to adopt his mother's and intended, with her consent, to petition the Tsar for permission to make the change. When lying under the bed, indignant at all the world, he had thought among other things of this. Who did Voskobynikov think he was to meddle so outrageously with his life? He'd teach him where he got off. And that Nadia, just because she was 15, did that give her the right to turn up her nose and talk down to him as if he were a child? He'd show her. "I hate her," he said several times to himself. "I'll kill her. I'll take her out in the boat and drown her." His mother was a fine one, too. Of course she'd lied to him and Voskobynikov when she went away. She hadn't gone anywhere near the Caucasus. She had simply turned around at the nearest junction and gone north to Petersburg. And was now having a lovely time with the students shooting at the police, while he was supposed to rot alive in this silly dump. But he'd outsmart 'em all. He'd kill Nadia, quit school, run away to his father in Siberia, and start a rebellion. The pond had water lilies all around the edge. The boat cut into this growth with a dry rustle. The pond water showed through like juice in a watermelon where a sample wedge has been cut out. Nika and Nadia were picking the lilies. They both took hold of the same tough rubbery stem. It pulled them together, so that their heads bumped, and the boat was dragged into shore as by a boathook. There the stems were shorter and more tangled. The white flowers, with their glowing centers looking like blood-specked egg yolks, sank and emerged dripping with water. Nadia and Nika kept on picking flowers, tipping the boat more and more, lying in it almost side by side. "I'm sick of school," said Nika. "It's time I began my lifetime. I went out into the world and earned my living. And I meant to ask you about square root equations. My algebra is so bad I nearly had to take another exam." Nika thought there was a hidden barb in those words. Naturally, she was putting him in his place, reminding him he was a baby. Square root equations. Why, he hadn't even begun algebra. Feigning indifference to conceal his feelings, he asked, realizing at the same moment how silly it was. "Whom will you marry when you're grown up?" "That's a very long way off. Probably no one. I haven't thought about it. I hope you don't think I'm interested." "Then why do you ask?" "You're stupid." They began to quarrel. Nika remembered his early morning misogyny. He threatened to drown her if she didn't stop calling him names. "Just try," said Nadia. He grabbed her around the waist. They fought, lost their balance, and fell in. They could both swim, but the lilies caught at their arms and legs and they were out of their depth. Finally, wading through the sticky mud, they climbed out, water streaming from their shoes and pockets. Nika was the more exhausted of the two. They were sitting side by side, drenched to the skin. No later than last spring, after such an adventure, they would have shouted, cursed, or laughed. But now they were silent, catching their breath, overcome by the absurdity of the whole thing. Nadia seethed with inner indignation, and Nika ached all over, as if someone had beaten him with a club and cracked his ribs. In the end Nadia said quietly, like an adult, "You really are mad," and Nika said in an equally adult tone, "I'm sorry." They walked home dripping water like two water carts. Their way took them up the dusty slope swarming with snakes near the place where Nika had seen the grass snake that morning. He remembered the magic elation that had filled him in the night, and his omnipotence at dawn when nature obeyed his will. What order should he give it now, he wondered. What was his dearest wish? It struck him that what he wanted most was to fall into the pond again with Nadia, and he would have given much to know if this would ever happen.